So if you're still with us, good for you. This is part 3 of the Dere Street, or the Leeming Lane part of Dere Street anyway. And this is about the coming of the railway, its effect on the stagecoach trade, and eventually the coming of the motor car and what it did to the railways. The early 19th century saw the beginnings of rail travel. Railways had been used for a number of years in the mines, where it was much easier to pull trucks along on metal rails using horses. And some entrepreneurs decided to extend this idea to build railways between towns. And the first one was proposed in 1819 in County Durham, to build a railway from Darlington to Stockton. But it crossed the land of a chap who was called the Earl of Darlington, who was a fox hunting fanatic, and he decided that he wasn't going to let this clanking, noisy, smoke emitting steam engine cross his land, because he thought it would frighten the foxes away. But following 6 years of negotiation, one assumes a sizable lump of money was exchanged for this. The line was rerouted slightly and opened in 1825, which was the first railway of its kind in the world. But in addition to being pulled by steam engines, some of the trains and wagons were pulled by horses, so it was a very, very slow business. We might wonder what this has got to do with Leeming Lane. But approval was given for 4 railways. The main York to Darlington line arrived in 1841, and shortly afterwards a line was built from Ripon to Thirsk, which of course crossed Leeming Lane at a level crossing with gates, and that arrived in 1848. Shortly after that, in 1853, the line was built from Leeds to Northallerton and beyond. And then much later, in 1875, a line was built from Melmerby to Massam. And then in 1878, finally, the line from Northallerton to Bedale, which crossed Leeming Lane at Leeming Bar, it carried on up Wensleydale and was built sort of bit by bit, eventually reaching the main West Coast line in 1878. But when I was looking at the 1856 map, I noticed on to the west of Leeming Lane, from Melmerby Junction, marked a disused railway. It was just a very short section, ran from Melmerby up to Burniston, I mean, people in Burniston, when I spoke to them, never heard of this. In 1846, a company was set up called the Northern Counties Union Railway, with the intention of building a railway from Melmaby all the way to Clifton near Penrith. So it was due to travel up to Bedale, where the Northallerton line finished, and then from Bedale all the way up Wensleydale, where there wasn't a railway at all, and then up Mollastang to Kirby Stephen, and then across to Clifton. 1846. This was 15 years before the Stainmore line, as we knew it as kids, came into being, and it was 30 years before the Carlisle to Settle Railway was built, and it was 32 years before the line from Bedale up through Wensleydale was built. So this was a really, really early railway venture, and was obviously going to cost a fortune. It was a two-part venture. These railways were approved by Act of Parliament, and this particular Act of Parliament had two railways combined, two railway ventures combined. This one from Melmaby across to Clifton, and a second one from Bishop Auckland across to T-Bay. The Earl of Darlington now elevated to Duke. He was now called the Duke of Cleveland. He had investments in other railway companies, and he wasn't very happy about this new venture, because they were in competition, but of course affect his shareholding and the interest gained on it, and so he put all kinds of objections up, and being the owner of massive estates in County Durham, he said they could only cross his land if they paid him 25,000 quid. Well, 25,000 pounds in the 1840s was an absolutely huge sum of money, millions, and as a consequence of that, the whole scheme was abandoned, and they'd only laid 2.5 miles of track north of Melmaby, although they'd fenced off the line of the railway up as far as Burniston, but again that wasn't very far. Anyway, to recoup some of their losses, they sold off this 2.5 miles of track to the Leeds and Thirsk Company, railway company, for £8,000, and that was the beginning of the new line from Leeds to Thirsk, which crossed Leaming Lane at a level crossing with gates, and this next picture is just of the Leaming Lane level crossing and where it was. Disappeared long since, but it was still there until about, I would think, the 1940s, when a bridge was built over the top of it. This Northern Counties Union Railway, or 2.5 miles of it, crossed Heel and Beck by a bridge which is marked on the 1856 map. And just out of curiosity, one day, when the rivers were in flood and there was no fishing, I decided to go and have a look and see if this bridge was still there. So I've come up Heel and Beck,
from the A1 to see where, if there was any evidence of this Northern Counties Union Railway, which came to nothing. So that over there is Helam Farm, and here is the buttress of the bridge, which carried the bridge over Helam Beck. Well, isn't that amazing? 1846 that was built. It's now 2015. So the railway came across those fields there, which you can't see for those bushes. If I turn round, it continued across this field on its way to Burniston. In fact, they didn't get to lay the track to Burniston. They only got 2 miles of track laid, but it was, the route of the railway was all fenced off up as far as Burniston, with the exception of Hopetown Nurseries, which for some reason or other they missed out. But well, that is absolutely staggering that this is still here. It's quite substantial. You can see the brickwork there. It's right away down there. So it's quite big. There's nothing on this side. So the railway went over those fields and down on its way to Melmaby. I doubt very much whether anyone knows what it is. And there it is. The remains of a doomed railway venture. It's supposed to go all the way from Melmaby right away across to Penrith at Wensleydale, through via Kirby Stephen, and he got as far as this. They only built 2 miles of track, but they built a little bridge here, well, it's quite a big bridge I would imagine, over Helam Beck in 1846, and that's it.
It was amazing. After 171 years, I mean, this being 2015, that this still existed. I don't suppose anyone knows what it is. Anyway, the arrival of the railway meant the demise of the stagecoach. Railways were fast, they were comfortable, but more to the point is they were cheap. And the stagecoaches sort of disappeared overnight. The last stagecoach travelled along Leaming Lane in 1847, which was, 22 years after the first railway opened between Liverpool and Manchester. I mean, people who had never ventured very far from the village, they'd probably go from the village or their farm up to the nearest town for market, which was only a few miles. They piled onto the trains and went to see the sea for the first time. It's difficult to imagine. And this was the beginning of seaside resorts. Places like Redcar, Saltburn, Blackpool. And to see the sea for the first time must have been absolutely amazing. And most of these places, these inns along the side of the Great North Road. Trade disappeared, and most of them reverted back to farming. I suspect a sizable number had been run as farms anyway, sort of farms come pubs. But with there being 14 of them, with a small population, they must have subbed some stuff. So thousands of horses were sold off dirt cheap. Stagecoaches were all scrapped, and that was it. The end of the stagecoach era and the beginning of the railway era. But it only lasted 120 years before it was having major problems. In the 1880s, the internal combustion engine had been invented, and things called motor cars began to appear. I remember talking to my grandfather about this. He was born in 1877 and lived in Kirby Stephen, and he and his friends thought that the motor car would never catch on. They were far too unreliable and incredibly expensive. It's a bit like today buying an aeroplane. But of course they were proven wrong. In the early days, cars were all hand-built. And only people like the landed gentry had them, the aristocracy. It was a sort of plaything. I used to drive around terrifying the horses. In fact, terrifying people for that matter. I mean, the fastest thing up to that point had been a galloping horse, which, I don't know, would be 15 miles an hour. Suddenly these things come fleeing along the roads, kicking up clouds of dust at speeds which could only have been imagined 10 years before. In fact, it was so bad at one time, there was an Act of Parliament which meant that people had to walk in front of a motor car with a red flag. But that didn't last very long, especially as Parliament was governed by essentially the landed gentry, the aristocracy, who were the owners of these things. By 1900, more and more motor cars were beginning to appear on the roads. Henry Ford in America had developed the assembly line. Up to that point, cars had been handmade. Maybe 5 or 6 people all worked on a car in a static position, or doing several different jobs each, to produce this motor car, which was a very expensive piece of kit. But with the assembly line, the men stood still and the cars went past in a sort of line, and each man had just one specific little job to do. And it made cars incredibly cheap by comparison with the handmade jobs. And thousands of cars were produced. So instead of being a rich man's toy, it became every man's ambition to get one. 1880 saw the end of the turnpikes. Road maintenance was handed over to county councils, and they weren't very happy about it because it was going to be an expensive business, and they would have to find the money to do it. But by 1922 it was all sorted, everything had settled down, and the roads were all numbered, and what was the Great North Road up till that point became the A1. Oh, with the increase in motor traffic, it just couldn't cope with it at all. No, the road was widened and one or two bendy bits were taken out, and traffic struggled on until the 1950s. Dualling of Leeming lanes began in the late 1950s, and on a bridge at Cinderby Junction there's a little sign there, says 1957. And it continued apace for several years until the Leeming bypass was opened. I think it was 1961. Leeming bypass left Leeming and Londonderry almost isolated. So what had been a very, very busy road running up through Londonderry, Leaming and Leaming Bar was suddenly just a little country road, albeit called Roman Road and Leaming Lane in places, because the dualling of the road made living alongside it very, very difficult. Because it had been dualled and widened, a number of properties were much closer to the road than they had been, and it was intolerable living there. The noise, the dust and fumes were just overwhelming, and a sizable number of properties were just abandoned and left. Not only was there an increase in domestic cars, transport of goods also shifted from the railway to the roads. In the old days you had your goods picked up by the railway company transport, who took it to the goods yard in the station, offloaded it, loaded it onto a train. It was taken to a goods yard somewhere else, having been through various sidings and shuttled about, offloaded, uploaded onto the railway transport and taken to its destination. It was a cumbersome, expensive and time-consuming business. So goods were shifted onto lorries, much better. The lorry picked it up from your business and delivered it at the other end to where it was supposed to go. It might have been to a warehouse where it was offloaded and shunted about, but it was a much quicker and less expensive business. But of course, the roads by this time were becoming more and more dangerous. Roundabouts, which of course were unheard of until this increase in motor traffic, and very successful they are. Lorries increased in size. I mean, some of the lorries we've got on the roads today are absolutely enormous. And dual carriageway with these unique things called roundabouts, and slow-moving farm vehicles, tractors doing about 10 miles an hour. They became very dangerous places. And if one lorry decided to overtake another, it could take the neck end of 5 miles to get past. And angry motorists all queuing up behind it, waiting for it to get out of the way. And of course, as soon as it pulled in, they were off. They were off like hell. Again, it was didn't encourage good driving practice.